transfer batches, and setup time reduction. A production batch is a collection of flow units that are produced between two setups. So the example of our parts for the scooter were production batches. A transfer batch is a collection of flow units that are transferred as a group from one process to another. A transfer batching is often dictated by economies of material handling or transportation. So, right, it is basically cheaper to transport units or transfer them in larger quantities than one. Now, in transportation, often using larger batches is unavoidable. If I have to ship units by a truck, it is always a good idea to avoid sending the truck too frequently and rather loading the truck with a larger number of units at the same time, maybe with multiple products, right? However, internal transfers often can be reduced, and if you use large batches for internal transfers within the same facility, you often create a lot of unnecessary inventory and also increase the flow time, which, right, both of which are not a good idea. Increasing flow time and increasing inventory will lead to problems we will discuss in this course, right? So always where it's recommended to transfer flow units as the smallest quantities, even one by one. And internal transportation actually can be often eliminated if we use appropriate layout of resources. So for example, right, in an assembly line, of course, we put station 1 next to station 2 and then the station 2 next to station 3 so that the scooters can be passed from one station to another easily, right? The same thing, maybe the production of the parts for the scooter should be located such that it doesn't take too much effort to transport the parts to make them available for the assembly line. Now, setup, the best lesson, the most important lesson from the setup time chapter should be that, the best way to manage setups is actually to not have them at all, or at least to reduce them as much as possible. There's this idea in production called single minute exchange of die. The idea is that, there used to be very long setups, very time consuming for some machines. And then people have figured out smart ways of making the setups much shorter, take much less time. And of course, that improved the production systems considerably because you have a small setup time, a very short setup time, you can actually produce in smaller batches and without sacrificing the capacity. Now, the idea of reducing setup time is basically thinking about what are the tasks that are performed during the setup time. Let's break down the setup, right? Disaggregate it and find out if there are any tasks that seem to be internal tasks that, must be executed when machine is stopped, right? And kind of waste the time of the machine and make them into external tasks. So tasks that could be done while the machine is processing a batch, we prepare something that will speed up the setup for the next batch. And a good example is when you use some kind of baking, for example, in an oven that you have at home or even industrial ovens. A good idea is to have multiple trays, right? When you bake one set of cookies, let's say, and you still have one more set to bake, it's a good idea to have a second tray and load the cookies on this tray while the first one is being baked. When the first one is finished, the setup is almost instantaneous. You open the oven, remove one tray, put the other tray that you have prepared with the cookies, the second set of cookies, and then close the oven, and that's it, right? The setup is almost instantaneous. If you don't have the second tray, you would have to have a much longer setup time, which would, right, involve removing the baked cookies from the tray and then putting the fresh unbaked cookies on the tray, right? So it would take much longer to set up for the next batch production, right? So this is an example where without much investment, you can change the internal tasks of the setup into external ones and therefore considerably reduce setup time. And final comment about setup time reduction is that setup time on non-bottleneck resources is really not important. If you have a resource which has a lot of capacity, even when you produce things at a very small, with very small batches, and still this is not a bottleneck, then it doesn't make sense to try and improve, reduce the setup time on this resource. Only when the resource at small batch sizes is becoming a bottleneck, this is where it makes sense to work on setup time reduction, right? Because this is what will lead to improvement in capacity when batch size is very small.